Morning everyone. I've spoken about suggestive witchcraft often on this channel. There's one thing I've mentioned about suggestive witchcraft, and that is that it's accusation. I may not have said it directly, but I'm saying to let you know. Suggestive witchcraft is accusation. And I mentioned before in a video I made in 2016, accusation will always lead to assassination. Accusation is like the contract that a mobster hands over to a hitman to kill someone. That's what accusation is. So suggestive witchcraft is really delayed assassination. That is what suggestive witchcraft is. See it for what it is. And it comes down to this. When there is something a group of people don't want to face, or when there's something they don't want to give up, that holding on or that resistance causes tension. That tension weights them down. They don't want to be weighed down, they just want to be relieved and left alone. So what do? They seek for a weak point somewhere to dump their negativity, to dump their waste. And the easiest way to achieve this is to trigger the target into the negativity. Because once the target is drawn into negativity, it's easier to dump the violence on the target. Why do you think that when, for example, criminals want you to pay the money, they threaten you first? Why don't they just come to you with the gun and shoot you? That is because, energetically speaking, they need to have an access point to you first. In movies, they show you as if people can just commit any type of violence they want, anywhere, anytime, without any limits. That's not true. Spiritually, that's not true. When someone is a child, for example, they are quite vulnerable. They can't do anything. That's different. But the moment someone has matured into their teenage years and beyond, you can't just do anything to anyone, anywhere you want, just like that. It doesn't work like that. People that participate in collective witchcraft, because suggestive witchcraft is a form of collective witchcraft, they need you to agree with their accusation. The way they enforce their accusation on you is through labeling, suggesting that you are at fault while you're not, or by using some kind of direct assault, by someone being honest against you, just to dump their negativity. In any way, they need you to agree with them. And the easiest way a lot of people agree with suggestive witchcraft is by defending themselves. Listen to me carefully. Christ grew up in Galilee. That was considered a ghetto, a periphery in ancient times when Christ grew up over there. So there was violence, there was a lot of prostitution, there was a lot of danger there. There were Roman veterans that weren't paid well by the Roman state, and they went around attacking and killing people. And the region where Christ grew up, what we call the Middle East, was a very contentious place with a lot of rivalries. The moment Christ grew up, there was a lot of rivalries in the Judean community also. So Christ didn't just walk around allowing people to do whatever they want to him. That's not what turning the other cheek means. Turning the other cheek simply means you overrule violence by exhausting violence so that violence will destroy itself, while you, not only do you remain free from harm, but you remain far better off. And if possible, the perpetrator is freed also from violence, but that can't always happen. Some people are just wicked. Okay. About defending yourself, standing up for yourself, is really demanding people to validate you. That's what it comes down to. And it always comes down to violence. And people say, well, it's justified, you need to defend yourself. Why not teach people how to avoid negative energy, or how to overrule negative energy? Because all physical violence is the result of negative energetic contention. So if you teach people about energy fields and how to overrule or bypass negative energy, then they will also avoid physical violence, which also includes gun violence and everything that relates to it. But they don't teach you that. They teach you to stand up for yourself, to use violence to combat violence. Now, here's why standing up for yourself is tricky. And I'm going to give a parable to illustrate this. Let's say now you had let me think of a country. You had Vietnam, for example. And you had the Chinese Empire that wanted to annex Vietnam. The king of Vietnam had no intention of becoming a vassal to the Chinese emperor. He wanted his people to remain free. So the Chinese sent diplomats to collect taxes. Because that's what the Chinese Empire did. The Han Dynasty and also the dynasties that followed, they sent out their diplomats and they were kind of intimidating the local rulers outside of the Chinese Empire to pay taxes to the emperor. Because China was an economic center, so for it to be able to trade in an economic center, you had to pay tribute to the emperor. But there were ethnicities or kingdoms outside of the Chinese Empire that had their own local economy and they were fine with it. But the parasitic Chinese imperial regime wanted the worship of all those people. So they sent the diplomats to intimidate the local kings and leaders to pay taxes. Now here's the thing. If a diplomat comes and you treat the diplomat in a hostile manner, it will be the same as treating the head of state in a hostile manner. So that would be seen as a declaration of war, right? If you receive the diplomat and agree to pay just to be left alone, you would be acknowledging the emperor also. So this Vietnamese king did the following. The men came with their bags and some Chinese soldiers expecting the silver. So what did the Vietnamese king do? He said to his ministers, when the Chinese come, receive them in a building, ask what they come to do, and do another offer to them. So the Chinese diplomats came, and well, they expected to get the taxes, but they didn't get them. Instead, the Vietnamese ministers held parties. They were laughing all the time, making jokes. They didn't take the demand seriously. So the Chinese diplomats were confused. They were thinking, we're coming from the great Han Empire. Don't those people know that we are the center of the world, that the Son of Heaven, the Son of the Serpent God, is ruling China? Don't they know that crossing China's will have consequences? The Vietnamese ministers were not intimidated at all. So the Chinese diplomats left because that cheerful environment, they couldn't stand it. When they returned back to the Chinese capital, the emperor was furious. So he sent more diplomats. This time, the same thing happened. So after a while, the Chinese emperor didn't send any diplomats anymore. Here's what happened. They didn't fight against the Chinese influence because that would be self-destructive on themselves. Because a war wouldn't benefit them. If you have an empire with over 300 million people and you only have around 10 million people or maybe 5 million people only in your country, guess what? That, militarily speaking, in numbers, that won't be a benefit for you to fight against the Chinese Empire. But to give in was also not an option. So what did they do? They acknowledged the Chinese presence, they even received the Chinese diplomats, but they didn't agree with them. When they came with that serious, accusative attitude, they just laughed it off. They just acknowledged it, but they didn't give in to it. So the Chinese court got tired of sending diplomats. But here's the thing, if they would start a war against Vietnam, the Chinese people who were under Chinese rule would realize, hold on a minute. You guys claim you have a mandate of heaven to rule over us. But those people over there, the Vietnamese, they received you. They treated you well. They just didn't agree with what you were doing. So if you have a mandate of heaven, it should have been obvious to them why they should agree with you. They didn't treat you well, they didn't declare war, anything like that, and now you just go off at them? If they would go off at Vietnam, they would damage their own image and the whole foundation of the rule of the people. If they would attack Vietnam, whoa, they would expose themselves and it would destroy them. So the Chinese court did not send any diplomats anymore to Vietnam to collect any taxes. That doesn't mean that China didn't intend to invade Vietnam anymore, but they just couldn't do it. That Vietnamese king, he was wise. He looked at the bigger picture. He evaluated the circumstance well. And he also knew the Chinese empire is not unified. You have many internal kingdoms in it that are kept in line by the Chinese court. So for them to attack Vietnam and destroy their own reputation would mean that everything would fall apart. This Vietnamese king, he knew the situation, he was alert, and he acted in line with reality. He, as Christ would say, turned the other cheek. And by turning the other cheek, China had two options. Either they act out because their will is not validated. If they do that, they will destroy themselves, and they would have to blame themselves for it. Or they could give up. Well, giving up would also mean self-destruction. So China began to ignore and avoid Vietnam. Trade with Vietnam continued, but there was less diplomatic contact. Why did I give you that parable of that Vietnamese king and the Chinese emperor? Because that's how you need to do in this world when common people want to track you in the negative. When you are free, when you're operating in righteousness, because remember, righteousness is your connection with Holy Spirit by the renewal of your mind. The renewal of your mind, just like a Wi-Fi connection, it connects you to the Holy Spirit, where the power is. And once the power works out through you, that's holiness. So holiness is just an outworking of the power through you. That implies you overruling evil with good. That's also holiness. When you operate in righteousness, worldly people, not all worldly people, but worldly people in general, will become upset. And once they are upset and you realize that they just can't act it out on you, they can't just erase you from the earth, they'll remain with the charge. And just like that Chinese emperor, they don't know what to do. They can't deal with the situation. So they'll begin to flee from you. But that doesn't mean they gave up, because at a distance they will still try and hope to send some of their heaviness towards you. Because they are charged by their own investment in the negative. They blame it on you. Well, it's not you. They just want to get rid of it, and they will become desperate to charge you with it. What do? Just like the Vietnamese king. You don't go off at it to defend yourself. You don't just open up yourself and allow it to happen and make it easy onto them. You overrule it. You overrule it by remaining positive, by remaining Christ-centered. And while they keep sending that negative waste, they are exhausting themselves. That's how they're being drained. And once they're drained completely and there's nothing left of them, they collapse. While you remain standing. There are countries throughout history that avoided being occupied by a far bigger military power by playing it smart. I mean it. I mean, people think just because one country has more military, it means automatically they can overrule other countries. No, it's not how it works. You need to frighten the population that you want to rule over. It's the fright of the population that enables you to rule over them. It's not the military. The military is just a show. Okay? That's why they have all those parades and all those uniforms and an static attitude. The military is just a show to intimidate and impress the people. But you need them to be intimidated first before you can rule over them. You get what I'm saying? Now, of course, if you have a small village of 200 people and you have 3,000 troops, that's different. That's obviously a physical advantage at the side of the army. But if you have a population of 3 million, for example, and you only have 15,000 troops, the only reason those 15,000 troops can mean so much to the people is if they're intimidated first. If you're not intimidated, that army cannot rule over them. So that means a system can rule over them. And here's one thing I want to reveal onto you. In this world, it's the common people that enable their own oppression. And it's the common people that will go after you when you refuse to submit to the oppression they enable. As long as you enable their oppression and you permit them to get away with anything, anywhere, anytime, even when it's at your expense, then they're good with you. The moment you operate in freedom, you operate in real righteousness, and you have impact, the moment you're like that, they have issues with you. How do you deal with it? Just like that Vietnamese king. That's why Christ said, be of good cheer. When he said, be of good cheer, that was a commandment. Okay? Why? When you are of good cheer, you automatically are not sucked into the negative. You automatically are not intimidated. You have a good cheer because he has overcome the world. So you have backup for being cheered. It's not like a drug addict that takes drugs just to be at ease and laugh and forget about everything. That's not the case. Christ said, be of good cheer because I've overcome the world. He didn't say be of good cheer or else you can't handle the situation. He didn't say be of good cheer so you can cope with it. No. He said, be of good cheer because I've overcome the world. So if he has overcome the world, doesn't that mean that you should be inspired by him and follow in his ways so that you can walk in his victory of the world? If a pagan Vietnamese king can overrule the paranormal intoxicated Chinese emperor and his Han army, of the Han dynasty I mean, then the believers are far more capable of overruling evil with good and overruling the whole camp of the enemy. It won't be easy, but it's worth it. Be at peace.